the title to the project, Challenges of Migration, Integration, and Exclusion. The research network was an initiative of President Martin Straatman, president of the Max Planck Society, who suggested that Max Planck institutes bundle forces to see whether with their expertise in migration, they could contribute to the development and the consolidation of research on refugee and migration as an academic discipline. It was led by Steve Vertovec and Ayelet Shahar, initially both directors of the Max Planck Institute for Research on Multi-Religious and Multi-Ethnic Societies, and by myself, already introduced by Daniela Vono de Villena. The coordinator was Dr. Zeynep Yanaz-Mayan, as well, from the Max Planck Institute here in Halle, and she will accompany us the whole upcoming hour. She will collect the question and answers, and also Zeynep Yanaz-Mayan will be sure that whenever one of us refers to a document that is available or accessible, that she really types the references so that you can really follow also from that point of view the discussions and the preparation to the Q&A. We will produce an academic paper of this research. It is for the moment under revision for the translation so that we have it in 2 languages. The authors of the academic paper will be also the presenters of this afternoon, namely Constantin Hruschka and Miriam Shader. The paper, as said, will be available in a few days. Now, let me very, very briefly introduce, we selected out of the many contributions to the research 4 papers that will be presented successively by 4 of the researchers that have been very active in this WIMI research initiative. The first will be Luc Leboeuf, who in the meantime has become a principal investigator of a European research project on the vulnerability of asylum seekers and the way this vulnerability is being assessed. Since 2015, European policymaking was increasingly relying on political instruments, but including informal agreements that come with considerable risks and opportunities, and in particular serve the purpose of limiting the influx of migrants. At the European level, there is, and everybody feels it, no clarity on how handling situations where people lack access to international protection, but also cannot be deported for legal or factual reasons. This will be the first presentation. The second presentation will really dig into the gaps of this lack of protection mechanisms for lack of coordination between European level and national levels. And this will be the presentation by Catharina Ziebritzki from the Max Planck Institute in Heidelberg. The EU hotspots in the Mediterranean region, initially developed as instruments of short-term aid for the countries of first entry, are now locations characterized by immigration restrictions and long-term stays, as she will explain. Then will come Tino Hruschka from the Max Planck Institute Social Policy and Law in München, focusing on how the German legislators responded with what he calls hyperactive legislation. Frequent legislative changes since 2015 have resulted in changes to the right of residence and asylum to such an extent that a fundamental reform of the legal framework, in his view, is necessary to make the guidelines more uniform and transparent also for the administration. It is for him of critical importance to reduce incoherences and unintended exclusionary effects. Last but not least, Miriam Shader, anthropologist at the Max Planck Institute, already mentioned in Göttingen, has been doing observations at municipal level. A significant part of the rapid immigration in 2015-16 was processed at the local level. Despite the considerable challenges that municipalities faced during this period, they often demonstrated their efficiency. In dealing with the rapid influx of refugees, however, in some cases, they also resorted to closure and externalization in order to cope with the challenges Cooperation with civil society at the local level was also crucial. In particular, her study shows that some municipalities have exhibited the capacity not only to respond to rapid migration movements, but also to develop strategies for dealing with anticipated challenges and to adapt structures accordingly. All in all, as I said, calling the situation following the events of 2015 a crisis is not doing justice to the complexity of the situation. The long summer of migration and its consequences are not just to be seen as a moment, they are also to be seen as a process, and probably we have to be prepared that there will be other long summers of migration. But I now leave the floor to the speakers. I would maybe ask the speakers to really stay within the time limit of 10 minutes so that we do have sufficient time for the discussion first to be introduced by Steve Vertovec and then to switch to the question and answers. Please don't forget, put your question and answers in the box and you will see Zeynep Yanazmayan will take care to refer to the documents that we will mention by the speakers as they speak. Can I give you the floor to Luc Leboeuf?
Yes, thank you very much, Marie-Claire. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me just share the presentation. All right. I think everyone should now be able to see it. Well, thank you very much, Marie-Claire Foblets, for the very kind introduction. What I will do in my presentation is to discuss and to give an overview of the legal and policy developments that occurred at EU level with the view to controlling migration to Europe in more preventive ways. And what I mean by that is controlling migration to Europe before migrants actually set foot on European territory. I will do so while focusing on the developments since the Wirtschaftswunder of 2015, and also while giving a particular attention to how these developments are shaping the current forms of migration governance to Europe and what it's telling us in the end about the way all societies are dealing with the exclusion of migrants that is inherent in every border policy. But let me maybe first remind you of the link that exists between the Wirtschaftswunder and the development of these instruments at EU level. I think all of you within the audience are already aware of the fact that the Wirtschaftswunder wasn't an isolated policy move. This policy move by the German government sought to ensure effective access to protection to the migrants who are on European territory, but it was also accompanied by a huge push by the German authorities at EU level to have additional mechanisms being adopted to make sure that the secondary movement of asylum seekers from outside Europe to Europe becomes limited. One of the examples of that, and one of the very concrete results being the EU-Turkey statement that I guess most of you are already very familiar with. This policy move to tire a policy move with the development of further mechanism at EU level with the view of limiting the secondary movement of migrants is actually not an isolated event. It fits within a much broader policy trend that has been into force since the past decades and that has been labeled in the literature as the externalization of EU borders. That trend was already existing before 2015, but it has been accelerating ever since, and that's why I'm focusing on it now. The consequences of these developments from an institutional and legal perspective is that the lines are getting more and more blurred between the policy domain of justice and home affairs and the policy domain of the common and foreign and security policy. These are very different policy domains at EU and domestic level that involve different institutions and different kind of public servants, different public servants with different backgrounds. We have public servants within interior ministries, we have the police when it comes to justice and home affairs, and we have public servants within ministries of foreign affairs, diplomats when it comes to the common and foreign security policy. The externalization of EU borders has the consequence that the policy tools and mechanisms that are being used are increasingly those that are traditionally being used as part of the common and foreign security policy. So one can see, as a result of that trend of externalizing the EU border, a shift in the way border policies are being constructed from a purely internal perspective, from a focus on justice and home affairs policy tools and legal instruments, to the greater use of the CFSP toolbox. And that's what I will intend to discuss today in greater details. But before going on with the findings that I could find and I could label and highlight while doing this research, let me maybe just say a few words about the data I'm using for today's presentation. Today's presentation is based on a study not only of legal and policy documents, but also on interviews that have been made with public servants that are active at policy-making level within EU institutions and within the administrations of one EU member state, that EU member state being Belgium. I used these interviews as a way to complement the understanding I could have of these developments based on the reading of the EU legal and policy documents, which do not always give the full picture. I interviewed 15 public servants, and I made sure that I chose them among public servants with different backgrounds, and I make sure that there is an adequate mix between public servants having a background in justice and home affairs, public servants that are active within the ministries of the interior, and those who are active within the common foreign and security policy. What this study allowed to reveal is that, first of all, there is a great informalization of the EU border policies as a result of their mainstreaming through the common foreign and security policy. Well, I'm sure this finding doesn't come up as a surprise for those of you who are actually involved in that kind of policy making, but it didn't happen from one day to the other one. It's the result of a very progressive process. This process started with the increasing emphasis on the adoption of international agreements and readmission agreements, namely with a specific basis that was introduced into the treaty, to the further use of the CFSP toolbox under the umbrella of the global approach to migration and mobility. So there has been a real shift here from using the most traditional policy and legal tool of the CFSP, that is international agreements, to using many other policy tools that are also available and that are of a much more blurred and informal legal nature, such as not only military missions, the fund that exists to support development aid, but also the setting up of informal forums of cooperation and more formal ones that lead in the end to having a very varied mix of instruments that allow to cooperate at international level. This leads to a quite complicated picture, and even more so that because we're dealing with so many aspects of the common and foreign security policy, because these border policies are somehow affecting all the aspects of the common and foreign security policies, a lot of different competences are also involved, and there is a lot of difficulties here in dealing with different levels of competences, not only between the domestic and the EU level, but also between domains that resort more and that fall under the sphere of influence, so to speak, of the justice and home affairs, and those that fall under the sphere of influence of foreign affairs. This greater informalization of the border policies through their mainstreaming, through the common foreign security policy, also has a different, a related consequence. That related consequence is the invisibilization of the EU border policies. Why? Well, first of all, because as I said before, we are getting towards a framework that is getting increasingly complicated, that rests on sometimes very informal forms of cooperation, that rests on a good and sometimes one-to-one relationship public servants can have from one ministry to another one. There has been some attempt at mapping the different instruments that already exist, but none of these attempts claim exhaustivity, and rightly so, simply because informal forms of cooperation cannot always be identified. But this leads to various issues when it comes to democratic control of these forms of cooperation. Something that came up quite often with interviews that are involved with public servants that are involved in the European Parliament is that the MEPs face a lot of difficulties in exercising the control over this development of the EU border policies, because they have difficulties in identifying the relevant instruments and what's actually happening. When this trend was limited to the adoption of international agreements, democratic control was relatively easy, because in such case, the European Parliament was competent and was required to vote on the adoption of the international agreement. When we move into informal forms of cooperation, such vote is not required anymore. And this can lead, of course, to concerns that are quite often raised, especially by a civil society organization, regarding the respect of the rule of law. And these concerns are serious, they are legitimate, especially when one can see that sometimes informal forms of cooperation are actually taking the place of more formal forms of cooperation. What do I mean by that? Well, I will give you a very concrete example, and that's the contested Joint Way Forward Agreement with Afghanistan, which is, formally speaking, considered as a soft law instrument that doesn't need the approval from the European Parliament, but which, in terms of content, takes over the exact same content as a classical readmission agreement. This can be a worrying trend, especially when the intricate competence structure at EU level implies that judicial control is becoming increasingly difficult, as illustrated by the case law of the CJEU regarding the EU-Turkey statement, among others. Now, what I'd like to raise is that these threats and difficulties that are being identified are somehow also counterbalanced by some promises. And these promises are quite often put forward by the public servants who are involved in the development of the external dimension of EU policy. They highlight that, after all, informality and invisibility is a feature of the conduct of international relations. If we want to have some kind of truly holistic approach to migration governance that takes all the different parameters into consideration, and if we want to have a truly multilateral approach, then we need some degree of informality and invisibility. And using that kind of informality and invisibility is what leads us leads at least to some promises. And this promise is that in the end, we'll have more equilibrated policies, because the interests of migrants and the fundamental rights of migrants will be put forward by third countries who are not always so keen into entering with agreements with the EU to control migration to Europe. So that's a bit the general promise that is being made here, that in the end we will reach equilibrium, and we will reach fundamental rights protection through other mechanisms than the classical mechanism being provided for by the rule of law. Now, of course, that it remains to be seen whether this promise will indeed materialize in the future. There has been some promising developments in the field. Just think about the adoption of the global compact. But it remains to be seen what the future will hold. And that leads me, in the end, to my conclusion. And that conclusion is that we were used to address border policies. We were used to address the social tensions and disagreement that result from the border policies and their exclusionary effects through the rule of law, through the legal system. And that was possible as long as the border was apprehended as a single reality, as a territorial reality that only concern situations that are happening on the territory of the state. And at the time, it was perfectly possible to have that logic, because we have a very important body of law and has been developed, and that guides us on what to do and how to deal with migrants who are on European territory and that present themselves physically at the physical border, understood as the fixed control point located at the edge of the territory of the state. Public servants with justice and home affairs are also very used to operate in that kind of environment. And in interviews, they often express their unease at the fact that when they are dealing with the externalization of EU border policies, they are kind of evolving outside of this relatively regulated environment that gives a relatively high degree of certainty. I fear that this reality might be a bit over, and that if we want to truly understand what the future of EU border policies will be, we need to look beyond these legal developments. We need to have a look at what's actually happening in these invisible spheres where the international agreements are now being negotiated and concluded, while keeping in mind maybe that there are also advantages to this. And one of the main advantages might be that we are now bringing in the expertise of public servants with a different background, that have a different professional attitudes, that have a different way of dealing with migration, and that also have a different perspective on migration. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Luc. And I think, and I propose that we immediately switch to you, Catharina, because with you, we will zoom in really in the reality of this border control over what is known as the EU hotspots. You hear me, Catherine?
Yes, I do. Thank you very much for the kind invitation, Professor Foblets. Good afternoon also from my side. I will now share my screen so you can see my presentation. Okay, does this work now?
Yeah.
Can you see? Okay, perfect. So the question, as has been said already, that I will address in the next 10 minutes, can be formulated as who is responsible for Moria. There's of course a political and a legal answer to this question, and both are closely interlinked. However, the study that I have conducted within the Max Planck Research Initiative focuses on finding a legal answer. Yet I would like to start with a few words on why EU hotspots do matter. We have to keep in mind that those camps have been operating for over 5 years now. They have become quite a permanent feature of the common European asylum system. And we got to a certain extent used to those camps. The conditions might have shocked us in 2016, but not apparently so much anymore in 2020. And as media need news, EU hotspots do only reappear in public discourse in case of extraordinary events. Now this year, there were already 2 such events. First, the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then second, the fire that destroyed Moria on 9 September in 2020. Besides Moria, which is usually in the center of media attention, there are 4 very similar camps located on the islands of Chios, Samos, Leros, and Kos. Those 5 EU hotspots in the Aegean are operating since 2015. Since March 2016, the return policy of the EU-Turkey statement is supposed to be implemented in those centers. Yet, in the vast majority of cases, Turkey cannot actually be considered as safe third country. This, and specifically not the lack of enforcement of return decisions, is the reason for the until now very low number of deportations from the hotspots to Turkey. In short, as long as EU hotspots have been operating, their structure has been systemically deficient. One of the reasons is constant and severe overcrowding. In January this year, for example, 4 out of 5 persons were forced to stay in makeshift shelter or camping tents. I know that all of you are familiar with pictures of the hotspots. Those photographs are hence only intended to illustrate the absence of any improvement over the past 5 years actually. So what you see here is the EU hotspot Vial, located on the island of Chios in the winter of 2017-18. And what you see here is the same camp 1 year later. Now, nobody can say that we didn't know. The systemic violation of individual rights is common knowledge since 2016. The deficiencies are well documented in numerous reports by several international organizations, by EU bodies, by national bodies, and by several well-established NGOs. What is more, the European Court of Human Rights has granted in the past years several interim measures obliging Greece to accommodate the concerned individuals in compliance with Article 3 ECHR. In November 2019 already, the head of the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights described the EU hotspot approach as the single most worrying fundamental rights issue that we are confronting anywhere in the European Union. Now, what does the Commission propose in its new migration pact? The pact promises a fresh start. At least insofar as the hotspot approach is concerned, that promise seems to be not fulfilled. Quite to the contrary, the hotspot approach is actually strengthened. First, by the new idea of a so-called screening prior to the border procedure, and second, by the broadening of the scope of application of the border procedure itself. Now, if we take a step back, what do we see? On the one hand, immense human suffering created by an EU policy in systemic violation of EU national and international law. And on the other hand, that same policy has by now become a permanent element of the common European asylum system. Against this background, it seems, I think, quite obvious, maybe even trite, to wonder, what about the rule of law actually? According to Article 2 TEU, the EU is founded on the values of the respect for human dignity, the respect for human rights, and the rule of law. And one of the most basic implications of the rule of law is that all exercise of public power must be subject to judicial review. The right to an effective remedy, as enshrined in Article 47 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, ensures that principle. Every individual subject to administrative conduct must have access to judicial review before court. This brings us to the main question, namely, who is responsible? The most common answer is probably Greece is responsible. This is certainly true insofar as responsibility under the ECHR is concerned, and probably also under EU law. Not much attention is usually paid so far to the possible responsibility of the participating member states. This is an open question, which I will, however, not address here. Instead, we will now turn to what I think is the most interesting question, and also the most politically relevant question, namely the responsibility of the EU. It was indeed the European Commission who has put forward the EU hotspot approach. And what is even more important, both EU agencies and the European Commission are closely involved in the administration of those camps. In order to find out whether the EU is responsible, we have to understand how the EU administration works. We must know exactly what the EU does in order to answer whether the EU is legally responsible. Now, the EU hotspot administration is quite a complex thing. It consists of three sets of actors, namely EU administrative bodies, the host member states' administrative authorities, and international organizations and contracted private actors. The EU and the host member state form the core of the administration. Their cooperation is usually described as integrated administration. From this perspective, our question can hence be reformulated on a more conceptual level as, does the integration of the administration lead to the integration of responsibility? We will now have an even closer look at what the EU bodies actually do. The European Commission is responsible for administrative supervision. This follows from Article 40 of the Frontex regulation, read in particular in light of recital 55 of that same regulation. The Commission is exercising its task of administrative supervision in the framework of the European Regional Task Force. As the rules establishing that task force are non-public, that body is often overlooked. Yet I think that the EU RTF, the task force, is a crucial element of the EU hotspot administration. The EU agencies Frontex and EASO provide operational administrative support. More specifically, they deploy staff as part of the so-called migration management support teams. Frontex is inter alia responsible for the transport of the asylum seekers to the camp and the first registration. EASO is inter alia responsible for conducting asylum interviews and drafting legal opinions recommending the rejection or the acceptance of the asylum claim. After all this quite technical administrative details, I will now have to take you shortly to legal doctrine. But we will go step by step, so I think it will be okay for everybody. First of all, we have to agree that what we mean when saying judicial responsibility is technically liability as regulated in Article 340, paragraph 2 TFEU. Liability, more specifically, requires three preconditions, namely unlawful conduct of the Union, a damage, and a causal link between both. Now, does the EU administrative involvement fulfill those criteria? When I had a closer look at this in my study, I found that there are actually three critical legal issues which require extensive doctrinal analysis. We cannot go into details here for reasons of time. I'm happy to answer more questions on this in the Q&A though. Nevertheless, it might be good to know already now what the three issues are. The first question is whether conduct by a staff member of an EU agency can actually be attributed to the agency itself, namely Frontex or EASO. The second question is whether the criterion of causation is fulfilled even though the administrative conduct of the EU is non-formally binding. The third question concerns supervisory obligations of the Commission, more specifically, the limits of the discretion of the Commission, and again, the question of causation. Now, after all this, I think we can take a step back again and somehow take stock of what we have done so far. To be sure, there are not only conclusions, but also some open questions. Concerning the doctrinal analysis, I think that the more convincing legal arguments speak in favor of the EU's liability. Yet, further analysis is needed, and there are certainly also legal arguments for the opposite opinion. So far, the European Court of Justice has not yet decided this question. Until now, no such action for damages against the Union has been lodged. I think most probably due to financial and political risks of such an action. The outcome of such an action for damages against the Union would of course depend on the circumstances of the individual case. But I think at the same time we should not forget about the political nature of decisions of the European Court of Justice on the EU's responsibility. I think this aspect is very well illustrated by the judgment concerning the involvement of the EU in the conclusion of the EU-Turkey statement, which has been mentioned by Luc Leboeuf in the previous presentation. In other words, I'm not certain whether the court would politically dare, so to say, to hold the EU liable for fundamental rights violations in EU hotspots. What is certain, I think, is only that the issue of liability is already now highly relevant and would become only more relevant if the proposal of the new migration pact was realized. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to your comments and ideas.
Thank you so much, Catharina. And no doubt there will be questions because you raised them and they cannot remain unaddressed. Thank you so much. Can I then switch immediately to you, Constantin?
Yes, thank you very much. I will also share my screen for you. And now we're going a step more local to the German asylum and migration law, and especially the question of legislative hyperactivity and its effects. So what we will do now is to look at what is meant by hyperactive legislator and about the context, and we look at the effects, and we look at what we identified in our research as the return turn, and then we go to some conclusions. So for the introduction, at the Max Planck Institute for Social Law and Social Policy, there were several projects in the WIMI framework, and the main legal project is what I'm presenting now, that was conducted by my colleague Tim Roman, who also works a lot about vulnerability, and myself. And then there was a project of our social policy department on migration, on Syrian refugees in Bavaria. And then we decided to have a joint project, which is a survey on Afghan migrants. And there were more than 1,000 interviews conducted in 3 cities. And we looked at qualifications, cognitive and non-cognitive abilities and a lot more, and especially on expectations. And we designed a questionnaire with legal status as a focus. And the legal project on legislative hyperactivity is kind of the basis, the legal part for the legal part of the survey. So there are more results to come. If we look at the context, we were in a situation in 2015 where a lot of fake news were done. For example, this was called an invitation, and we were also talking very much about the non-adapted legal framework for the asylum applications of so many people. And what we can see in historical context, that always if asylum applications were going up, we had an increase of asylum legislation, and we had a big increase after 2015. And so the first question was actually the legislator hyperactive? And we said that this was clearly the case because we had more than 35 legislative changes in less than 4 years from 2015 to 2019. And that's acts that have changed. So a lot of more provisions have changed. So we have a legal framework that had constantly been changing every other month. Which makes it very difficult to understand the rules, because you have to know the rules. You have to know which rules are actually in place at this moment. And these rules are not simple because there is integration, there's residence questions, there are asylum questions. So it's complex and incoherent, and it was already complex and incoherent. And with all these changes, these effects increased. And for the asylum seekers, it's kind of incomprehensible. What we saw also from the Syrian survey that the social policy department did. So we had formal legalities, no problem, because it was done by the legislator, but the problem is there a rule of law problem? And with these amendments, we can see that they were looking at 5 main aspects. It was integration support and administrative modifications to enhance efficiency, but also facilitation of deportations, the reduction of security threats, and the reduction of alleged pull factors and abuse, which means deterrence. And our analysis was then that, of course, there is an evident conflict between the objectives. We see that the link between the residence status and the access to social rights is weakened because we cluster persons alongside nationalities and protection rights, and not so much anymore with the residence status, asylum seeker status, and all of this. And these different rights, they are especially visible in the asylum procedure with the prospects to remain, and this increases fragmentation because even a status internal fragmentation is there, and these differentiations are obviously not intended by international or EU law. So that was kind of our starting point, and you can apply this framework also to the migration package. If you see the 2019 migration package, you can see that there are so many different objectives, and you can break them down to the 5 categories that I showed you. And this was 8 acts adopted in 6 weeks in 2019. And we still have other acts coming in and entering into force on different dates. But still, this was presented as a coherent package. But if you look at it, fragmentation is actually what you find. You have a conclusion of what is called the return turn in asylum and migration legislation, but you also have a focus on skilled workers. You look at data exchange and you see securitization exercises, and you have a backlash in the naturalization law, which basically makes the naturalization dependent on the acceptance of the German social norms, whatever this is. And still, there are some things that are still open and discussed. So we will look at new laws as well. So this is the procedural law component. which means this is already difficult on the German level. And if we look at the new pact on asylum, the European dimension 2020, it looks quite the same, because we're trying to get rid of Dublin and save the Schengen area and replace Dublin by a smarter mechanism. But the smarter mechanism, if you look at it more closely, it looks like Dublin, and it has no real changes, but it states to change. So which means what will be the effect? And then we have the border controls idea. That was the two presentations we had on the external dimension already. The internal dimension is the prevention of secondary movement. So we have internal border controls that will also affect the Schengen area. We have a procedural dimension with border procedures, but protection dimension is missing in most of the communications on the pact. So we can also see it's presented as a coherent package, but it's not. It's very diverging. It's skilled workers, it's also resettlement, but it's also these components that I have here on the slide. So we will see that this is very much fragmented also in the discussions to come. And it is the same as in the German case that we studied. So what is the effect on the hierarchy of norms? If you blur the international standards of public international law and EU law, and then in practice, they will not be observed. After the wave of legislation, a lot of journalists, but also policymakers thought that there is no European law on asylum and that we just are about to create a common European asylum system, and the knowledge gets lost. So we are down to German law. But German law is so incoherent that in practice, policy and decisions are made on decrees and circulars. And the question is, does that actually undermine the role of the rule of law in this area as a whole? And one of the more worrying trends in this regard is the return turn, because that basically had a turning point on New Year's Eve 2015, where the German legislation turned to the security issues very much. And the aim of this return turn is efficient returns. We work with instruments like sanctions, like hindering access, like prioritizing returns, and we use procedural tricks like the fiction of non-entry, like safe countries of origin, safe third countries, and use protection rates to cluster persons, which means that these effects basically do not look at individual protection needs. And this gets kind of out of the picture, which is basically normally the idea of the asylum procedure, to see who needs protection and who does not need protection. So I'm coming to my conclusions. The effect is a diverging and doubtful administrative practice, looking at pushbacks at internal and external borders. We have internal border controls, and these phenomena put the Schengen area at risk as a whole, the area of freedom of movement and of justice. We have a multi-level system. This is decentralized, and it leads to a fragmentation of the law. We see that yet now with the new pact, even more on the European level, but there's still a standstill. We don't know where this is going. For the German case, in our research, we can say the hyperactivity, the crisis legislation has led to a further fragmentation of the already fragmented residence and asylum law, which means we have a legal and practical ambiguity that is working in a perpetuated crisis mode and leads to discretionary powers for administration at the local and regional level. And of course, this is problematic, which is why we were looking at keys to solutions. And of course, the international dimension would be putting the 1951 Convention and the jurisdiction and access into the focus. On the European dimension, we need European states to work together and not against each other. And the idea in Tampere 21 years ago was a common procedure and a uniform status, and that would probably solve the issue to some extent. Still, it's a hot subject, and we need a CJEU and a European Asylum Agency that lives up to what they are supposed to do. And on the national dimension, We need to talk about national courts, how they interpret European and international law. We need to have there more knowledge about public international law and EU law, and a better representation of these international dimensions all over academia, policy, but also the legal framework. That would lead to fair and efficient asylum procedures. And this is more a debate on values. What do we value? Is return really our priority, or is protecting the persons that need protection our priority? And that leads to my conclusion. We need more individual assessment and less policy making in this area. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you also so much to you, Tino. I began by saying that the project was interdisciplinary, profoundly interdisciplinary, but so far we have been listening to 3 exposés by lawyers, 2 at European level. Then with you, Tino, we digged into the national situation in Germany. And then I would like to give you the floor, Miriam, you anthropologist. You have been really looking at these individual assessments at municipal level, as really doing this micro study, and we would really like to hear you for the last 10 minutes before we switch to the discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Marie-Claire, for this very kind introduction. I'm actually a political scientist more than an anthropologist, so I don't want to claim a false identity there. Yes, but I did look at the micro level and would like to present this, or parts of this, today. And I'm now sharing my screen with you. Oh, this is the correct. Okay. Yes, I looked at what happened in 2015 and 16 when many newcomers came to Germany, and what happened at the local level. I'm sorry, this is not working. So now it is working. We've already heard a lot about this situation when very many people came to Europe, and several 100,000 asylum seekers arrived in Germany within a few months. I'm saying very many, but of course in a global context, this is not very many. Just for the not very well prepared German systems of registration, claims processing, and refugee reception, these people were a large number, and those systems reached their limits. And authors, both in the media and in academia, quickly spoke of a crisis also of the administration, and even some of a state collapse. And the question that arises from these descriptions is, did we really see this? And what did happen at the local level in 2015 and 16? There's, of course, a growing literature on refugee reception in Europe, and also with a special focus at the local level, but the question still remains, what did happen in Germany when so many people came, or when just a number of people came, but the systems were not well enough equipped to deal with them? Did we really see a crisis of the administration? And more importantly, what are the medium and long-term effects of this situation? I tried to contribute, or I'm trying to contribute to answering this question, and I looked at 2 not so big cities in Lower Saxony, which is a regional state of Germany, and at one mid-sized town, so even smaller, that is close to one of those cities, also located in Lower Saxony. I chose these 3 cities in the same regional state because I wanted to keep the legal and political context at the state level the same. I conducted expert interviews, analyzed documents issued by the municipalities themselves, like integration concepts, and also and other documents in this realm, and also analyzed the media reports on the situation in these 3 cities. Why look at the local level? Because the local level is so central in how the German welfare state works. This is where the state deals with people, the local level. So this is also where we should have seen a crisis of the administration and a collapse of the state first, or the most clearly. And also, almost all municipalities were affected because they had to accommodate and receive higher quotas of asylum seekers, and they also had to help regional states through administrative cooperation when the regional capacities had already been reached or had already reached their limits. So if we now look at the situation in this in the municipalities from sociological or political scientific perspective, we need some theory to do this, and I chose to look to borrow some concepts from the sociology of organizations, and to use the three concepts of risk, incertitude, and fundamental uncertainty to look at how people are received in general and how people were received in this time. And by using these concepts, I can show that this time really was a period of fundamental uncertainty for municipalities in Lower Saxony and most likely also all over Germany. We can see that risk is inherent to the reception of asylum seekers, because you never know whether really, I don't know, 10 men or 5 women or 7 children without parents or with parents will come in this and this week. This is not something you can plan according to fixed numbers and fixed statistics and so on. So there's always a certain degree of uncertainty when dealing with newcomers, because they live their lives, they're not just following rules. Then there's a more substantial form of uncertainty that's also always present in local refugee reception. That's incertitude. There we have, for instance, new measures that are introduced at the regional or federal level, and municipalities do not know how likely these how likely the effects of these intended effects will materialize. But they do know what the measures are and how they should materialize and what the outcome should be. Fundamental uncertainty is really different in that there's not enough knowledge to know what the potential or the intended developments are, what the measures could be. There are not enough statistics. Even the regulations and the legislation are changing. And that's really different to the other forms of uncertainty that are inherent to the reception of asylum seekers at the local level. Let me just illustrate what this period felt like for people who were responsible for the reception of asylum seekers in those cities that I looked at. So one person, he was a head of office in the smallest of the 3 cities in northern Lower Saxony. He said, the fact that it was all done very, very disorderly by the federal government at that time is a completely different story. So my civil servant's heart was bleeding. I admit that quite openly. So I had huge problems at that time with the way it was done. People were just sent here according to the model. Now you get off the bus and from now on you can do whatever you want. I still don't think that's right, but that's another story. And his colleague in the southern city said, so the quota was 1,200 at the time. The quota says nothing. The quota is a number that is given at a particular time. In other words, it was then mid-December 2015 when this huge quota came. And then there's no end. A quota starts on one day, but they do not tell you when it ends. The time frame's not fixed. So what they express here is a very intense feeling of not knowing. And if we look at the material, of course, this is much more encompassing than what I've showed you here. We can see that the timing and the numbers, so the who will arrive when and how many people will come and what will their needs be and will they stay, that this was a huge challenge for municipalities at the time. Also, this is a second main factor that contributed to this fundamental uncertainty. That's they didn't know what would happen over the next weeks and months and even more long term, because they didn't know whether the borders would be closed, whether it would be worth renting buildings for 5 years or just for 2 months, and so on. So they couldn't know what the political developments would be. And then, as my colleague Tino just outlined, a high number of important changes in German legislation occurred in this time that made things even more complicated for bureaucrats at the local level. So how did municipalities deal with the resulting high level of uncertainty? Did they just collapse, as some suggest, or did they find a way of reducing the uncertainty? So if we turn again to sociology, I said I'm a political scientist, but I'm now stealing a lot of concepts from sociology. In new institutionalism, we would find two concepts that help us understand what happened in municipalities there. They're mimetic isomorphism, so imitation, or externalization. In our case, this would mean some cities would say, oh, what do others do? Can we do this as well? And others would say, oh no, let somebody else take care of this. This is not our business. We can't deal with that. And indeed, this is what we find. We find two types of uncertainty reduction at the local level. In the very short term, we see that they reacted quite similarly. All three cities said, okay, we need to make sure that nobody will sleep in the streets, that everybody has something to eat, and that's it. So they turned to disaster relief measures in all three cities, and really did what they would have done in the case of what they termed a catastrophe. However, in the way they perceived, the way they dealt with this short-term situation, they already differ. So while one city said, okay, this really stretched our capacity, this was really too much. We really reached our limits, and this is, we couldn't do more than we did. We managed to do this, but we couldn't have done any more than that. The others said, okay, this really was very exhausting and challenging, but we did an impressive job, and we have very many capacities, and we showed flexibility and solidarity, and we did this now, and we already did this before. So we really have shown successes in dealing with diversity before, and we did now. So this is important because it goes along with also different reactions in the mid and longer term. Because the city that said, oh, wow, this was really to our limits, they also decided to delegate refugee reception to others, because they decided not to fulfill their quota. They just simply said, we are not taking any more people in. So should somebody else take them? They also said, this is not on us, it's not up to us to find a solution. This needs to be decided at a higher level. In consequence, they came up with no new structures and didn't make any significant changes to the way they receive refugees, to the way they prepare for situations like the one in 2015 and 16. Professor Foblets already said that we might witness a situation like this again, and they decided not to prepare for situations like that. In contrast, the other two cities who stressed their capabilities, they created new agencies and structures. They created both new offices dealing with the reception of refugees, and also more generally with diversity, migration-related diversity in their cities. And in one of the cities, the more wealthy city, they even have now between 40 and 50 new persons working in this realm. So this is a lot of money and a lot of personnel just attributed at this task. So what can we see? I think we can see in conclusion that the summer the time between summer 2015 and spring 2016 indeed was a challenge for municipalities, but in none of the three cities did the structures collapse. So we did have a period of uncertainty, but not one of breakdown or of crisis. And in 2 out of 3 cases, the uncertainty enabled local structures to change. They came up with new structures, which were helpful in the situation, but also helped them adapt to changes in society that we witness anyways. So in more theoretical terms, we saw municipalities react to the period of fundamental uncertainty with adaptation through structural change or externalization. And in either case, we did not witness a collapse of the state. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miriam. For the sake of time, Steve, I would say just give it a go, start, because we will have to compactize, so to say, the discussion and the Q&A in the remaining minutes. But I think it was good to give everybody a bit more time because it was an overwhelming number of data. I give you the floor, Steve.
All right, thanks, Mary Claire. Well, I'll be very brief because we are running over time, and I think we've got something like 300 people participating in the webinar, and we want to make sure people get a chance to ask their questions. Maybe while I'm talking here, people can already start to send in their questions, and our colleague Zainab will bring those together and ask them for you, and we'll get responses from the speakers. I see my role, I really just in a couple of minutes just want to sort of filter and elaborate some of the key findings. I mean, it won't do justice for me to say too much about the presentations you've just heard, but I want to emphasize and reiterate some of the things that Mary Claire said at the beginning. You've heard 4 project presentations, but in the Max Planck Society Research Initiative on Migration, there were actually 3 times that many projects spanning law, sociology, anthropology, political science, demography, and history. So there was a lot more there. And I think one of the main things I want to do is to point you towards the scientific report produced across all of these projects that will be available within 2 weeks. On the websites that I think Zainab already put very high up on the chat list. Maybe she can put those back up again. You can come both in German and in English. We have the research report on the entire initiative. And basically, I'll just pull out a few nuggets from that of key conclusions across all of these projects, disciplines, 6 Max Planck Institutes. And that is, again, the initiative was set up by the president of the Max Planck Society to take this broad interdisciplinary look at what were some of the consequences of the so-called long summer of migration, consequences on German society, on cities, on interpersonal relations, on law and administration. And of course, to do that, as you've heard, we included the European level because things that were happening within Germany were very much conditioned by European developments as well. And I suppose one of the things we set up to do is to look at how government reacted and what were some of the consequences of that. And if you take as some of the goals, what Germany was trying to achieve when Frau Merkel said, "Wir schaffen das," we'll manage that. Well, what were they trying to manage? Well, they were trying to manage the processing of a massive amount of people into legal claims, statuses, and rights, trying to provide people with accommodation, with social benefits, with basic health care, trying to provide people with training and education, including language training, trying to provide people with social and psychological care, with psychological counseling and legal counseling, and trying to provide access to the labor market. And this is an amazing undertaking. And we didn't set ourselves up to judge whether Germany succeeded or failed, but we wanted to look at basically how this goal was undertaken and what some of the ramifications were. And basically, what we found is that Germany indeed, if we call these modes of inclusion, that Germany did manage to get people in accommodation and in various kinds of training and in schools and social benefits and so forth. But at the same time, if we call those modes of inclusion, at the same time, multiple modes of exclusion were being put in place as well. Sometimes intentional, but very often unintentional consequences of trying to include people through legal measures, administration, interactions with civil society and so forth. It served also to exclude people, to restrict access to these kinds of benefits and trainings and so forth, or to inhibit participation in certain kinds of programs. And so this is what we managed through all these different research modes, is to be able to take a look at what kinds of modes of exclusion arose at the same time as inclusion was being facilitated as well. And we come up with a conceptual and theoretical framework for looking at this, and kind of language to look at the co-production of inclusion and exclusion at the same time. You can read all about this in the report. And you know, what are some of the ramifications of this? Well, I think some speakers already mentioned that indeed there probably will be some kind of next time in the future, especially in light of the climate crisis unfolding, a next massive movement of people. And so what can Germany learn from this previous massive experiment, if you want to call it that? And we make a number of suggestions, not least in terms of laying out more consistent and transparent apparatus for this processing of trying to include people, being more aware of the inadvertent kinds of exclusion that some of these measures are putting up at the same time. And so what we found is, again, a very uneven terrain or topography of inclusion and exclusion, despite often quite good intentions, as well as ones that are really looking to hinder the movement of people. So again, I hope these presentations and this short and insufficient summary whets your appetite, makes you interested, and I'll certainly recommend that you take a look at not only the list of publications that we've been seeing posted here, but in the scientific report that the entire team has produced out of this research initiative. Good. So let me turn over to our colleague Zeynep Yanasmayan to deal with some of the questions and put them to our speakers.
Thank you very much, Steve, for this. I would like to also add shortly that on the website, you can also click on the publications to be able to see actually all the publications that come out of our research initiatives, aside from the ones that has been here posted in the chat. Okay, without further ado, I'll start with the questions, and we already have started receiving so many interesting questions. So first question is for Miriam. So the question is, in your view, why did some municipalities reacted through mimetic isomorphism and others through externalization? Was it a political statement about migration? Was it economic capacity, or was it cultural issue? So what drives these different answers at the level of municipalities?
Well, thank you. This is a very interesting and important question, of course. I can only offer some elements of an answer. I think we can say that it's not economic capacity, because the poorest and the wealthiest city in my research opted for isomorphism, and the let's say the one in the middle said no. So I think it's not really just because you're wealthy you can adapt to the situation. It's also a political decision that you want to adapt to this. I think what is more important here is that we have some sort of path dependency, because especially the poorest city referred a lot to their tradition of being a city of immigration and also social democratic city. And same for the the richest city, the one that first came up with the idea of having a new office for immigration and refugee reception. They don't have the same history of immigration, but they do have a history of being an open city and a progressive city, and they're proud of this, and also let's say a social democratic city, not in a political sense of political parties, social democratic party, but in the sense of having a good system of public welfare also at the local level. So valuing this way of dealing with people. Yeah, maybe that answers at least a little bit your question.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is for Luc Leboeuf, and if I understand it correctly, so there's an agreement that we see more and more informal and invisible modes of migration, governance, and diplomacy. But the person asking the question is also interested in what kind of opportunities this kind of invisibility might bring to the table.
Right. Yes. Thank you very much for the question. I think that's a very interesting and key question actually when it comes to these developments. Maybe I will first say as a warning that indeed one must not be naive. We've definitely entered in an era of executive governance when it comes to managing migration to Europe, with an emphasis on a security approach, and that's something that very much impacts these developments. But at the same time, there are indeed some opportunities to see something a bit different. And why is that so? Well, I think that by moving further into the sphere of the common and foreign security and policy, we also have different approaches and different understanding to what migration should be. And when you speak with public servants that are involved within the CFSP, and you compare that with the conversation you have with public servants that have involved in justice and home affairs, this comes up quite clearly. In justice and home affairs, that's their job. They're focused on security, they're focused on improving return rates, they're focused on controlling the border. Diplomats, on the other hand, they understand that there is this need to negotiate with the countries. They understand that you need to give something back, be it through the establishment of some legal pathways. And maybe that's a bit something we can already see in the EU-Turkey deal with the resettlement scheme that's part of that deal. And moreover, these diplomats, they're also dealing with other policy priorities. So they're dealing with migration and migration control, and that's indeed where the emphasis is right now. But they're also dealing with other objectives for sometimes quite a long time that relate to development aid, that relate to having good relationship with third countries. And so maybe they're a bit more able to use these tools they have to, I wouldn't say leave the security approach, let's not dream about that, but still having that security approach with some counterbalancing effect and some counterbalancing mechanism. So that's a bit more what I will see as a priority. So I know it's a jump into the emptiness because we're losing the control we had with the rule of law as a result of this informalization and invisibilization. But maybe that's also a bit the price to pay to try to move forward towards something that's not exclusively security oriented at the expenses of the fundamental rights of the protection of the people seeking asylum.
Many thanks. Yeah, that's indeed a very interesting question. So the next question is not addressed to someone specifically, but I'm assuming to our legal scholars, which composes quite a bit of our panel today. So feel free to chip in whenever you want. So according to the proposal for the new migration pact, often the proposed legal instrument is regulation. So the participants interested in knowing what do you think about that? Is this problematic, taking into account the differences in the constitutional and administrative law of the member states? The procedural aspects are very important to guarantee the rights of persons seeking for international protection, and national constitutions might provide higher level of protection than EU law. So who would like to first go and answer this question? I mean, Luc, Catharina, Tino, feel free to jump in, all of you.
Well, I might start with like two observations on the regulations. I think there's already a lot of regulations out there, like the Eurodac regulation, the Dublin regulation, and there are some aspects that you have to do by regulation, directly binding, because if they're not regulated in a directly binding regulation, they wouldn't function. And that is kind of the idea behind the regulation also for the status and for the procedural guarantees and the procedures that are now staged. And I think that the problem is that this will not lead to a uniform practice, because if you look at Germany as a federal state, we have 16 federal states and 15 higher administrative courts, and very much the outcome of procedural law, but also of material questions of asylum, very often depends on the country of origin information and all of that. So, and the legal basis is the 1951 Refugee Convention and the European Convention on Human Rights, and they won't change with being in a regulation. And from a European law point of view, I think if you want a common European asylum system, you also need to have regulations. There's actually, from my legal perspective, no room for directives anymore if you want to move into a common European asylum system. The question whether actually there is more protection in national constitutions or the European Convention on Human Rights, to me, looking at the CJEU at the moment, it interprets the legal procedural guarantees according to Article 47 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And this is a combination of the guarantees of the European Convention on Human Rights, as well as like constitutional tradition. So I don't see that there is a problem that this is less protection. In a lot of member states, if these guarantees were actually applied, it would lead to more procedural protection. But this is my view on the current jurisprudence of the Court of Justice.
Anyone else likes to jump in into discussion? Luc, Catharina? No? Okay, then I would like to invite our participants to ask more questions at this point. We're very happy to answer. We have, of course, limited time left, but nevertheless, we're happy to stay just a little bit longer to answer more questions. Okay. I can always ask questions, but I don't want to abuse my role as a moderator here. So I would like to wait just a little bit longer to see.
No, I propose, Zainab, because when I see the people start leaving, we had really a session until 3:15. I think what we did, if people have no more questions, is we made available, I think, not only all the references that were used during the presentations, but people can return to us. So I think that might be the more fruitful way, unless in the meantime, there would be another question that was raised.
Mm-hmm.
It might explain why people do not raise questions, because we are in fact over time.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think the communication only started with this kind of way of exchanging. And I'm sure there will be people who return because there were too many open questions left unaddressed during the presentations.
I agree. And actually, I was going to also say something similar about future scenarios, what we're going to see now. So this is something that's going to stay on our agenda for a long time to come, I think.
Maybe then I return to you, Daniela, for the kind of more ritualized way of closing this meeting.
So thank you, everyone. It was a very nice webinar. We have learned a lot with all the speakers. Thank you to all speakers who joined us today. We'll make this webinar available on our YouTube channel, and we will email all the registered participants with the link. This will probably happen tomorrow. If you have seen a lot during the webinar that Zainab was sharing a lot of links related to the publications of the speakers and with information about the project. So feel free to explore. It has been a 3-year project that it's now ended, but with lots of publication, and I hope you enjoy exploring the website. So from my side, a big thank you, and hope to see you in future events we organize.
And from our side, Daniela, thank you to Population Europe. You did a great job. Thank you so much for the collaboration.